Some scenes in this program have been reenacted, including the depiction of certain crime scene investigations. Investigators in Canada are on the trail of a killer. The key lies in the victim's cells. But has fire destroyed all the evidence? At a murder scene, a handful of cigarettes provides the only clue.
Under a blue or alternate light.
Will forensic detectives be able to unlock their secret? This young man was imprisoned for a rape he swears he didn't commit. Can science prove he's innocent? When police are stumped, they may turn to detectives in lab coats to uncover clues hidden inside the human cell. One strand of DNA can finger a killer or set the innocent free. The new shape of crime detection is a double helix. In July 1991, a janitor in Vancouver, British Columbia made a routine trip to the dumpster. But what he found was far from routine. Inside lay a body burned so completely he wasn't sure it was human. He ran to call police. Across town, detectives Al Catley and Rick Crook responded to the call. The homicide investigators had done this drill before. What may look like a human body sometimes turns out to be a practical joke, a discarded mannequin, or some other case of mistaken identity. They hoped that was all it was. Still, they had to check it out.
So when we walked over to take a look at inside the dumpster, there was just the outline of a human body. And in fact, it was so badly destroyed by the fire that it was questionable as to whether it was human, or we've had some instances of bear carcasses being destroyed after illegal hunting or something like that. And we didn't rule out that possibility.
You can't.
No.
The thing is, though,
The officers approached the dumpster carefully, making note of details that could become important later. The dumpster was cool to the touch when they arrived. The fire had been out for hours. A stain spread from the corner onto the pavement. Whoever set the blaze used more than enough flammable liquid to destroy the contents. A close inspection of the contents confirmed that this was no false alarm. There, amid the ashes of computer boxes, wooden flats, and scrap paper, lay a human body. After the detectives made their notes, the delicate removal of the fragile evidence began. It was gently placed in a body bag so as not to damage it any further. Then it went to the morgue, where a pathologist would examine the body for clues to its identity. Anything else that survived the blaze was also collected and sealed.
not surprising. No.
Surveying the scene, the detectives realized the murderer selected his site carefully. An industrial park closed for the weekend, surrounded by brush and trees.
In fact, we did establish that people were driving by roughly the time that we think that the homicide occurred, or the burning occurred, and there wasn't anything. You could have quite easily have driven up here and probably out without really seeing what you would have thought was a fire.
Homicides are often solved in the first 24 hours when investigators follow hot leads. But in this case, the fire had gone out. The trail had grown cold. If the murder happened just 5 years earlier, Crook and Catley would have relied solely on hunches and their talent for bulldogging a case until they had the answers. But by 1991, when this victim died, Crook and Catley knew they had an ally in the lab. A powerful new tool had been added to crime solving: DNA profiling. Investigators no longer needed a shred of evidence to solve a case. They only needed a single cell. As personal as the whorls and lines of a fingerprint, but far more difficult to hide, DNA is the next wave in scientific sleuthing. Today, scientists can extract DNA on a sweat-stained hat left by a nervous killer, from saliva on the stamp of an extortionist's letter, or from dried blood or skin scraped from underneath a victim's fingernails. Microscopic evidence has always been left behind by criminals. Only with the advent of DNA profiling has it become incriminating. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains every detail that makes you human.
Back to where it was.
No two people, except identical twins, share the same patterns. DNA is small enough to fit inside the nucleus of every cell. Its shape is a double helix, like a spiral staircase wrapped around a column. Uncoiled, the double helix would stretch to 8 feet. About 99.5% of everyone's DNA is the same, but some sections vary greatly from person to person. By studying those sections, scientists can identify victims and unmask murderers. In the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Paul Ferrara runs one of the most progressive DNA testing labs in the country.
With the sensitivity of this technology, I don't know that I could go in and commit a violent crime and just not somehow leave something of me behind. And that's all it takes with this technology, just some little piece of me that's got a cell with a nucleus in it, and I'm in deep trouble.
Heat is the enemy of DNA, and fire is the bane of forensic investigators who try to recover DNA from torched crime scenes. A week after the victim was found, Crook and firefighters recreated the inferno to see if it could shed some light on the crime. Whether by design or accident, the killer left one lid open, creating a downdraft inside the dumpster. The rushing air whipped the flames into a frenzy. The surrounding trees hid what little smoke the fire produced. It burned at about 2,000 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. By comparison, a crematorium burns between 1,000 to 1,400 degrees for about 3 hours. Police were lucky to have any remains at all. Now they had to figure out who was killed here. All the pathologist could tell them was that the victim was a white female. Traditional methods at a standstill. Detectives focused on X-rays. They showed the victim was shot in the head, but they also revealed a feature detectives hoped would identify her. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist or dental investigator, worked on the case. Teeth are the hardest substance in the human body and the most difficult to destroy. When bodies can't be easily identified, odontologists look to the teeth to tell them about the victim. Their wear and condition can hold the story of a person's life, whether they were right or left-handed, drank water with fluoride as a child, or wore braces. By studying the victim's teeth, it was determined that she was in her early 20s. She had one extraordinary feature.
But the other thing that we realized when we examined the teeth was there was an extra tooth right in the center of the upper jaw between the upper central incisors. And those showed up very well in the x-rays that were taken after the victim died.
Crook ran a computer search that compared his findings with dental records of missing persons. None matched. Despite his best efforts, Crook was stymied. He still had a victim without a name and a murder without a suspect. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, a killer ran free, confident nothing could link him to his crime. What he didn't know was that a small piece of evidence could provide the missing link.
That looks great.
Oh, you cheated.
For 2 days, Detective Al Catley chased a ghost.
Good, good. And yourself?
Who was the woman in the
Karen, I'll tell you
dumpster?
what we had.
What awful chain of events led to her murder? Surely by now someone, a friend, a lover, a co-worker, was missing her. Catley asked his staff for missing persons reports. One stood out. Lynn Breeden, age 30. Her roommate filed the report. He had dropped her off at a friend's house. The friend saw her leaving a nightclub around 3 a.m. the night before the burned woman was found. She left with an unknown man. 3 days later, a woman posing as Lynn Breeden tried to empty her bank account. The woman presented a withdrawal slip with Breeden's account number.
Hi, I need to make a withdrawal.
Okay.
The teller knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. When she questioned the imposter, the woman became flustered.
To withdraw some money so I could pay some bills for her. Like the ID.
When the teller tried to detain the woman, she hurried out.
No, I need you to stay here.
Wait, I gotta go.
No, I need you to stay here.
A security camera captured the failed transaction. Analysis of the film revealed a man waiting for the woman in the parking lot. Police made a photo of the woman from the tape and ran it in the newspaper. She was identified and called in for questioning. She told police a friend had offered her $500 to scam the bank. She knew nothing of the murder. The friend was Chris Cruz, an exotic dancer who used the stage name Tony Devons. Detectives placed him under constant surveillance, then asked him to come in to speak with police.
Homicide squad.
Not realizing police were watching him, Cruz parked his car 2 blocks from the station and walked the rest of the way. The surveillance officers called Sergeant Crook to tell him they thought Cruz must be hiding something in his car.
In the 400 block Main Street.
When Cruz arrived at the station, police asked if they could search his car. He told them the car was at his parents' in another county. They knew he was lying. They told him they knew where he parked it, and they didn't need his permission to search it. Reluctantly, he handed over the keys. Forensic investigators took pictures of the car from every angle, carefully recording what they saw before touching it. They moved in closer to gather more evidence, collecting and photographing virtually everything. It was too soon to tell what might be important later. The men worked in teams. Some officers inspected the evidence, while others marked where it was found. Investigators found bloodstains on the sides and rear of the car. They marked the positions carefully. Later, the shape of the stains would be analyzed to calculate what direction the blood came from and its point of origin. These details are crucial for reconstructing a crime. Blood samples may also be collected for DNA analysis. Police searched the car inside and out. They looked through personal items in the back seat, hoping to find any piece of evidence to tie the victim to the car.
All right, it's 10:05. We're going into the trunk.
Next, they opened the trunk.
Oh, look at this right off the bat.
Inside, they found a gas can and other objects covered with blood.
Get a shot. One moment.
Beneath some clothing, they found several key pieces of evidence: a bloody tire iron and a .22 caliber rifle.
I'd say that's the
The
deal.
detectives now were almost certain Crews killed Lynn Breeden, but they had no way of connecting the suspect to the victim. Crews denied knowing her. He told friends he bought her identification on the black market, and police couldn't prove the blood on the car was hers. They needed to compare the DNA from the blood on the car to DNA from the victim. But where could they find the victim's DNA? They turned to David Sweet for help. He suggested looking for it in her impacted wisdom teeth. No one had ever tried it before, but it was their last hope.
We know theoretically that there are cells still embedded in the mineral tissues of the teeth, and we should be able to open the teeth, extract those cellular materials, and extract the DNA from the cells, and then process it in a forensic DNA analysis.
A tooth is an armor coating that surrounds a core of living tissue. Sweet hoped the tissue within the impacted wisdom teeth were protected from the fire by the thick jawbones surrounding them. He cut the first wisdom tooth from crown to root, but found no tissue inside. His second attempt was more successful. He found tissue, but he didn't know if its DNA was destroyed by the fire. He sent it to the lab to be tested. All he could do was wait.
Okay.
Did Chris Crews kill Lynn Breeden? The answer was in a forensic lab in Vancouver, where the victim's tissue was sent for testing. Finally, Dr. Sweet received the results. The DNA survived the fire. What's more, further testing showed the DNA from the victim matched the DNA from the blood in Crews's car. The lab calculated the odds that it wasn't the victim's blood were 1 in 540 million. Dr. Sweet proved that Lynn Breeden was in the car the night she died. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Chris Crews confessed to murder. Based on interviews, detectives pieced together a likely scenario of that fatal night. Breeden once borrowed a great deal of money from Crews. Now he wanted to collect. Breeden refused to pay him. Crews lost his temper. Growing impatient, she got out of his car. Crews beat her, shoved her body in the trunk, and drove to the dumpster. After he arrived at the secluded spot, the victim began to regain consciousness. Chris Crews shot her. He thought the flames would erase all the evidence. How could he know the charge of murder would come from his victim's own mouth? Found guilty of second-degree murder, Chris Cruz received a life sentence. In rural Clay County, Alabama, a drive along Route 31 leads to a town caught between memories and progress, where turn-of-the-century storefronts share billing with a new city hall, where folks still get their news word of mouth, and where bad news and good news travel at about the same speed. Summertime slow. It's a safe place where parents don't think twice about giving their teenagers free rein to explore the land. A place where violence is an unwelcome stranger. On July 22, 1995, 3 riders on all-terrain vehicles discovered a burned mattress in the woods, and beneath it, what appeared to be blackened bones. They contacted Sheriff Ralph Toland, who responded to the call.
You think you've got a body? 3 miles. 3 miles east of 4977 intersection. Okay, we'll be on our way.
The men met the sheriff and led him to their grim discovery. It looked like murder. Toland began to secure the crime scene, but knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to be sure no evidence was jeopardized.
I got down into the scene and I saw exactly what had happened. Saw the mattress charred and burned, nothing left but the springs over a skeleton. I just stopped everybody where they were at and told them to stop right there. Had them to go back out to the entrance from the road and ask them all just to secure it. I wanted forensic and the criminalist to come and help us collect all the evidence.
The man he wanted was Angelo Dellamana. A scientist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Dellamana never knows what he's going to find when he answers a call.
Whenever you get to a crime scene, you hope that it's been secure and cordoned off right after the discovery of the body. You don't want anybody into the crime scene that doesn't belong there. You don't want anybody messing up evidence. You want the evidence to be maintained in a secure fashion so that when you as a scientist get there to recover it, you can collect it without disturbing it, preserve it, bring it back to the laboratory, and do the tests that you need on it to find out who did the crime.
Dellamana marked the position of the body, the condition of the mattress and the surrounding area before he went to work collecting everything he could. Dellamana placed flags to mark the position of what little evidence he found. He marked 11 used cigarettes randomly scattered around the mattress. They hadn't been there long. That was a good sign. But who smoked them? The killer? The victim?
I felt it was going to be very hard not only to identify that person, but to generate some kind of evidence. I did feel at the crime scene that the cigarette butts present there were going to be very strong evidence because they did not look weathered. They were sitting up on top of the cushion of grass. I felt they had not been there very long.
As Dellamana assessed the situation, his technicians recorded the evidence. Since technicians don't want to leave part of themselves behind, they wear gloves. Dellamana's people had been trained so they don't unwittingly destroy the very clues that they're trying to save. If forensic scientists are careless in how they collect, store, or process evidence, they'll leave themselves vulnerable to attacks in the courtroom. After the evidence was marked, photographed, and recorded, technicians carefully collected it. Bodies don't just turn up without someone missing them. Sheriff Toland already had a sinking suspicion about who the victim was. The week before, Jimmy Paris called him to report that his wife, Peggy Laughlin, was missing. Sheriff Toland decided it was time for his deputies to pay Paris a call.
You can't think of anywhere else she might have gone?
It was no secret around town that the couple had more than their share of knockdown, drag-out fights. No one would be surprised if Peggy just decided to up and leave. Meanwhile, the medical examiner compared the victim's backbone to spinal x-rays of Peggy Laughlin. They matched. Jimmy Paris became the prime suspect. But where was the evidence? Paris denied being anywhere near the woods that night. Delamanna tried to put the pieces together, but he didn't have enough of them to complete the picture. The forensics team turned up nothing at the crime scene. The cigarettes were the only clue untouched by the fire. The answer must lie with them. Detectives told him both Peggy and Jimmy smoked.
You can be looking at a case and feel going in that there isn't very much evidence there. The investigators don't think there's very much there to work with. But when you, as a forensic scientist, find that small piece of evidence, that one link that can either nail the suspect or clear a falsely accused individual, the rush that comes from that makes all the long hours worthwhile.
If he could lift DNA from the cigarette filters, he could compare it to the DNA of Paris and Laughlin. If he could prove they were together in the woods, Toland could make a case against Paris. Delamanna shined an ultraviolet light on the cigarettes. The light revealed the saliva-soaked areas. DNA can be obtained from saliva and lip cells. He marked the outline of the glowing portion he wanted to test. Then he carefully trimmed it away and sent it to the lab for DNA profiling.
To build a DNA profile, what we do first is we take our evidence sample, blood or saliva or whatever the DNA is in. Okay, what we do is we break open the cell and release the DNA. So we extract the DNA from whatever it's on. We clean it up and we look at specific areas or addresses on the DNA, and we make millions of copies of that area big enough so that we can see it. Once the DNA profile is done for each person in the case, we can then compare it to the evidence DNA profile and see if there's any matches there at all.
He was encouraged by the results. The lab identified DNA from 2 people, and 2 of the cigarettes held DNA from both people, meaning they shared their smokes. Could Delamanna prove those 2 people were Jimmy Paris and Peggy Laughlin? Testing Paris's DNA was simple. Cooperating with police, he gave a blood sample, which provided ample DNA to analyze. But getting Laughlin's DNA proved much more difficult. Delamanna had to try extracting it from her remains. He felt the best place to look for the DNA was in the marrow of the femur, or thigh bone. The largest bone in the body, it's the one most likely to have protected DNA from the fire. Bone marrow is rich in DNA. To expose as many cells as possible, Delamanna ground it into a powder. He gave the powder to another scientist for DNA extraction. The scientist places the powder into a chemical bath that breaks open the cell's nuclei, releasing the DNA. Once the DNA is in the solution, bone fragments, chemicals, and impurities must be removed. The liquid goes through a series of microscopic filters. A centrifuge spins away the refuse. The filters trap the clean DNA. Theoretically, scientists can obtain DNA from just one cell. But to create a profile, they generally need thousands, though that number is decreasing. Not long ago, tests required a sample the size of a dime. Today, they can extract usable DNA from a drop of blood the size of a pinhead. The DNA is isolated. Now it's time to measure it. When the DNA is drawn through a membrane, it creates a band of color. By comparing the color, scientists can determine how much DNA they have. Delamana examines the results, which appear as small dark bands on a piece of film. DNA is measured in minuscule quantities called nanograms, or billionths of a gram. The test results tell Delamana whether he has enough DNA to work with.
Unfortunately, there's only about 0.3 nanograms of DNA in that sample. That's point and then 9 zeros and a 3 grams of DNA in that sample.
Delamana didn't have enough usable DNA for testing. But he had an ace up his sleeve, a scientific process so revolutionary, its inventor, Carrie B. Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. Up until 1993, scientists could test DNA only if they had large quantities. But bacteria, heat, and time take their toll, degrading DNA and leaving it in fragments. A process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, enables scientists to make multiple copies of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 chemical units: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These units are strung together like beads. A joins only with T, and G joins only with C. PCR works by splitting apart the double-stranded DNA like a zipper. The thermocycler heats the DNA, separating the A from the T and the G from the C, essentially unzipping the helix down the center. More of these chemicals are added to the solution, and the 2 halves of the helix use them to make themselves whole. Repeat the process, and the 2 become 4, and so on, until millions of copies are created and the sample can be measured. When making a DNA profile, scientists don't need to compare the entire DNA molecule. They only look at several sites along the helix. If these sites are the same on both samples, the DNA most likely came from the same person. It's considered a match. Scientists used PCR to create enough DNA from the bone to do a profile. But the quantity and quality of the DNA was poor, so they could measure only 1 site. But in order to make a match, they needed to identify at least 2 sites. How could they find that second site? Delamana knew that a child's DNA is a combination of both parents' DNA. To solve Peggy Laughlin's murder, Delamana needed help from her brothers and sisters. If he could do their profiles, then he could work backward and calculate Peggy's.
Once we knew we didn't have enough DNA to build Peggy's complete DNA profile, we had to go and get a blood sample from every one of her brothers and sisters that were in the United States. These samples came from all over the United States.
As Delamana's investigation continued, Sheriff Toland received a call about an abandoned van found in a neighboring town. A license check showed it belonged to Jimmy Paris. Inside, forensic scientists found blood on the ceiling and walls. Part of the carpeting had been torn out.
Over there. I tell you what, Dan, right. Above your head, right above your head.
Whoa, yeah.
You got 3.
I see it.
Based on this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Paris's home.
Hey, Jimmy. Hey. Sorry to borrow John. You let us in to help us just fine. Stand aside there, back off with John. Found you.
Deputies searched the house for any clues that could link Paris to his wife's death. But they found nothing. Then an officer checked the crawl space and found a section of blood-soaked carpet. It matched the missing piece from Paris's van like a jigsaw puzzle. The possession of the carpet linked Paris to the bloodied van. Police had the murder scene, they had the victim, and they had their suspect. The evidence was strong enough to arrest Jimmy Paris for the murder of his wife. But to strengthen their case for conviction, police needed to link Paris, the van, and the burned mattress together. To do that, Paris had to be placed with the victim just before her death. Angelo Dellamana was hard at work trying to accomplish just that. He was ready to make Peggy's DNA profile using the blood samples from her siblings.
We extracted them, put them through our full battery of DNA tests, and what we did was when we got the DNA profiles of the brothers and the sisters, we were able to work backwards and build the rest of Peggy's profile.
The genetic information Dellamana gathered from the siblings enabled him to complete the missing link on Peggy's DNA. Peggy's DNA matched the DNA on the cigarettes. Here was proof that Peggy was alive with Jimmy in the woods the night she died. For forensics expert Paul Ferrara, the DNA match was the kind of evidence that tipped the scales against Jimmy Paris.
When looking at DNA evidence and the weight that you put on that DNA evidence, take that and place it in perspective with other evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. And when you combine all of those together, then one can come to an informed opinion that a person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Paris had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Peggy Laughlin. He was a jealous man, and he'd begun to suspect Peggy of infidelity. On that night, he invited her into the woods. He brought along a mattress, placing it on the ground and covering it with a blanket. Peggy and Jimmy smoked and talked, casually tossing aside the spent cigarettes. There, in the saliva and lip cells, lay the code of the murderer's identity, waiting to reveal its secret. Then, something happened that triggered a rage that drove Jimmy Paris to homicide.
The baby is crying too.
You just leave the baby.
No, I'm gonna go get the baby. You hear me?
Paris knew he had to destroy the body if he wanted to escape detection. Probably thought that if police couldn't find a body, they couldn't link him to the crime. He couldn't see that the evidence he had already left would be enough to convict him.
DNA analysis was crucial in the sense that it placed both the suspect and victim at the scene together. And in that case, having those small pieces of evidence allowed us to put a guilty man in prison and allow the family to put closure to a terrible incident.
In Alabama and Vancouver, scientists struggled to find DNA evidence to link a killer to his victim. But the power of DNA is not just its ability to put people behind bars. It also holds the key to setting them free. Attorney Barry Scheck, part of O.J. Simpson's criminal defense team, doesn't believe everyone behind bars is guilty. Using DNA, he's making a strong case. Scheck heads the Innocence Project, a program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York. The program is dedicated to exonerating the innocent through DNA profiling.
Serological Institute.
And that they had actually responded, we have something but not enough to test.
Scheck provides the expertise. The students do the legwork, sifting through hundreds of cases, looking for those with the most promise. Once cases are identified, the students investigate whether the evidence still exists. If it does, they see if it can be used for DNA testing.
I don't know. There's nothing in the red well 2 yet.
It became clear to us that DNA had the power to go back into old cases, re-examine it, and exonerate people that had been convicted many years ago, that lots of people felt might be innocent.
The Innocence Project helped exonerate 30 of the 40 people released through DNA since the project began in 1992. Today, startling FBI statistics show that 1/4 to 1/3 of all DNA testing at its lab clears a suspect. No one knows how many innocent people remain in prison across the United States, but the Innocence Project is doing its best to find them.
Now we have all these cases of people who have been convicted who can credibly come forward and say, look, I didn't commit this crime. There was serological evidence that was introduced against me. There was hair evidence that was introduced against me, for example. Please test items in my case. It'll prove me innocent. And that's happening in case after case after case.
What were the circumstances of the identification?
Louise Hochberg is the executive director of the Innocence Project. In 1993, a convict named Troy Webb appealed to her colleagues for help. He trusted DNA to prove he was innocent of rape.
Troy Webb first wrote to us in 1993, and I understand from Troy that the way he got to us was through his cellmate, who apparently was also a client of the Innocence Project.
Webb was arrested in 1988 after a rape victim picked him out of a photo lineup. Eyewitness identification has led to most convictions where defendants were later proved innocent through DNA profiling. Hochberg believed in Webb's innocence, but it would be 3 years before she and her students returned him to his family in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The principal criteria for us is, number one, can this person make a credible claim of innocence? And number two, the most important, is there biological evidence in the case that we can test, which combined with other factors will be determinative, will prove that this person did not commit the crime for which he or she was convicted.
The Innocence Project had evidence in the case sent to Paul Ferrara's forensic lab in Richmond. There, scientists compared DNA from evidence left at the rape scene to DNA in a blood sample from Troy Webb.
The level of the technology, even 10 years ago, was such that we couldn't eliminate Troy Webb, for example, as the possible contributor of the genetic material. But by the same token, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate a large percent of the population.
Before they could start the testing process, the lab had to retrieve genetic material from evidence stored 7 years earlier. Once it was identified, they had to see if it contained viable DNA. They used an acid test to confirm the biological fluid was present. If the fluid is present, the indicator liquid turns purple. Another method is to use a light source, called an omnichrome, that makes fluids glow. If the scientist is looking for blood to test for DNA, she'll use a chemical called luminol to find it. Luminol can detect the faintest trace of blood, making it especially helpful in instances where blood may have been washed away by rain or where a killer has tried to remove it. In Troy Webb's case, investigators swabbed the evidence from the victim's clothing. The sample would contain the perpetrator's DNA. They'll compare it with Troy's DNA. Comparing DNA is a matter of comparing the lengths of strands of genetic code at specific points on the double helix. Scientists place the DNA sections they want to compare into a gel. The DNA has a negative charge, so scientists can use a positive charge to pull it through the gel. The longer pieces travel more slowly than the shorter pieces, so two pieces of the same length would move the same distance. If the DNA from the evidence and the suspect move the same distance across the gel, scientists know they're the same length and they have a match. If the segments don't move the same distance, they couldn't belong to the same person. The segment lengths can be seen and measured under lights that make the DNA fluoresce. These are the printouts of the actual DNA profiles in the Troy Webb case. They fade with time, so scientists take photographs for a permanent record. Scientists needed to compare only one site on Troy Webb's DNA strand to the DNA from the evidence. If it didn't match, he couldn't have committed the crime.
4.2, 4.3, and the corresponding pattern.
Besides comparing Webb's DNA to the evidence, it's also compared to the DNA of the victim and the rapist. The dot patterns make the differences between the DNA perfectly clear. None of the DNA matches the DNA from the evidence.
This DNA type did not come from Troy Webb, and the true rapist in this case is actually still at large right now.
On September 7th, 1996, the Innocence Project released the results. In Virginia, where new evidence may not be presented more than 21 days after sentencing, the only option was clemency. The governor reviewed the petition and granted the pardon.
There is no greater good that a lawyer can do, in my judgment, than to look back at old cases, and if it can be demonstrated that an injustice was done, to right it.
On October 16, 1996, Troy Webb emerged from prison a free man. The first thing he wanted to do was eat a 7-foot sub from Philadelphia Cold Cuts. He now works at the sub shop. He's made new friends and reestablished a bond with family. He lives with the same faith and hope that kept him going in prison, and he's grateful to the Innocence Project.
They're like family, really, you know, because wasn't for them, I'd probably still be locked up, you know. But they helped me, you know, for free at that, you know. So, couldn't ask for too much more.
All hope is not lost of catching the real rapist. Virginia has amassed the largest database of DNA in the country by collecting blood samples from every convicted felon.
20,000 a year.
Tens of thousands of blood samples pour in every year, creating a backlog of more than 135,000 samples in cold storage. Still, of the nearly 10,000 DNA profiles in the databank, Virginia has already solved 18 crimes by matching DNA from the crime scene. If the DNA from the case can be matched with DNA in the databank, the rapist will be found.
Our DNA data bank here was one of the early ones created. I think we had one hit in 1993, none in 1994, and then 5 in 1995, then 12 in 1996 alone. And the database, even in 1996, only numbered less than 9,000 profiles out of those 130,000 samples we have. When we get to the point where we have the convicted felon profiles, all 130,000 of them, the number of these hits is going to skyrocket dramatically until the point at which they are commonplace. If you are innocent of a crime, DNA technology is your best friend, your best ally. But conversely, if you're guilty, it's your worst enemy.
DNA profiling holds tremendous power for a technology still in its infancy. In its first 10 years, the diminutive double helix has quickly become one of the new detectives' biggest allies, bringing criminals to justice and delivering justice to the innocent.